welcome to the Socialist Feminist case for Bernie Sanders. We all know that Bernie is a democratic socialist, but Bernie is also a feminist. And while it would be great to have a woman elected president, the best person for the job just happens to be an old white guy who is also a socialist feminist. We have a great panel discussion planned for you that will drive that point home. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the theoretical background of tonight's topic before we hand it over. First, I'll talk briefly about the different feminist tendencies more broadly in order to locate socialist feminism specifically. We will discuss what is absent from some Marxist analysis of capitalism, namely social reproduction and the many ways labor, waged or unwaged, is divided along lines of gender, race, and class, and then what this means strategically for building a working class movement. So what is feminism? If you ask 10 different feminists, you'll probably get around 10 different answers. This is because there's a long history of feminist thought that tries to make sense of women's oppression. And various strands have come out of this history that look at patriarchy and gender in relation to other oppressive social relations in various ways. But there are three main strands that I'm going to talk about very briefly: separatist, liberal, and Marxist feminism. Separatist feminists focus on patriarchy as the primary cause of women's oppression, while they see capitalism as having little to do with it. This stems from the observation that patriarchy predates capitalism, which on the surface kind of makes sense, right? Patriarchy is ancient. But capitalism is not this static thing that exists in a vacuum. It changes, it appropriates whatever social relation it needs to survive to overcome its many inherent contradictions. And we can see this. Global capitalism today looks very different than the mode of capitalism a couple hundred years ago, or even 60 years ago. Social relations may have changed somewhat, but they still manage somehow to benefit capital. So the oppression of women preceded capitalism, yes, but the latter has profoundly modified it. Moreover, the simple binary between men and women is just not very useful in studying gender for many reasons, namely that it conceals the experiences that queer and non-binary people face. So if the last 60 or so years of feminist history were a contest, an ideological struggle, if you will, liberal feminism has definitely come out on top. This tendency holds that gender inequality can be eliminated through laws that end discrimination and promote equal opportunity and personal and political autonomy. Women are, after all, entitled to full human rights and should be free, empowered even, to choose their role in life and explore their full potential and equal competition with men in a capitalist society. But within this framing, we end up negotiating the terms of our exploitation rather than questioning and challenging the cause of that exploitation. Plus, legal rights can be very precarious, as we know from the all-out assault on Roe v. Wade and access to reproductive services over the last several years. Equal rights, while important, is not enough, and it's not the same as liberation and true freedom, which is freedom from exploitation and oppression. That can only be accomplished through solidarity with all workers rather than competition with only some of them. Which brings us to socialist feminism and the topic of this evening. Socialist feminism is a Marxist tradition that looks at how gender relates to class and other oppressive social relations under the totality of capitalism. Black feminists have contributed to this tradition and organize around the failure of white feminist organizations to adequately respond to racism. The term intersectionality was coined in the 80s to explain how Black women experienced multiple oppressions, but this concept was hardly new. Black women have been describing the multiple oppressions of race, class, and gender for a couple hundred years at least. The Combahee River Collective, for example, was talking about multiple oppressions reinforcing each other and building upon Marxism as Marxist feminists since the early 70s. Sadly, the mainstreaming of this concept of intersectionality was co-opted by capitalist feminists. It erases the Black Marxist feminist history of theorizing how race, class, and gender are hardwired and mutually dependent. So in the 1960s and 70s, and much earlier probably than that, while liberal feminists were demanding equality with men, Marxist feminists were asking equality with what kind of man? With what kind of men? Poor men, Black men, migrant men, men who are struggling to make ends meet? Probably not. Marxist feminists understand that patriarchy, and white supremacy for that matter, are not independent from capitalism. Most Marxists in general, though not all, would agree to some extent on that point, though the exact nature of the relationship is contested. Whether capitalist exploitation and oppression intersect, overlap, are constitutive of one another, or are completely and totally inherent to the logic of capital itself, most Marxists today agree that you cannot ignore these relationships under capitalism. So now I'm going to refer back to the main topic, how Bernie is the front-runner feminist candidate for the 2020 election season. I'm going to show how feminized and racialized social reproduction, sometimes referred to as care work, the informal economy, domestic work, or unpaid labor, is crucial to keeping the gears of capitalism in motion. It's also a concept that Bernie just seems to get, and it just so happens that it is strategically useful to winning socialism. In the simplest terms, social reproduction as a theory is a Marxist feminist theory that looks at everyday life under capitalism, including the relationship between economic exploitation on one hand and all social oppressions on the other. In the purely abstract sense, capital may be indifferent to the race, gender, or abilities of a worker so long as their labor power can set the process of accumulation into motion. But in reality, our sites of production and the economy itself are really just a jumble of complex social relations shaped by the past as well as the present. The social relations outside of wage labor, basically everything that goes on in our daily lives outside of the workplace from the time we leave work to the time we go back the next day, are not accidental to capitalism, but instead is a response to it. The study of capitalism is therefore incomplete if we look at productive or waged labor alone, without considering all of the social relations that sustain and regenerate the worker and labor power, whether that be the obvious things like healthcare and healthy food and quality education, but also leisure, public transportation, public spaces, art, pensions. In other words, production and reproduction are not separate, but coexist and sometimes overlap within the same system. And furthermore, these so-called non-economic social relations are conditioned by the economic impulses of capitalist production. You may have heard the term socialist reproduction before. It's often used in the classical sense to refer to the reproduction of the capitalist system, sometimes with negative connotations. However, if that system includes not only labor power, but also the practices and habits of everyday life that sustain and regenerate that power, the things that we do to attend to our own needs, then what we are doing conceptually is expanding what we consider to be strategic sites of class struggle, as well as the possibilities toward building worker power. Clearly, there's a lot at stake here in understanding production and reproduction as coexisting and unified. It also forces us to reassess common sense perception that we're no longer slaves to capital after we leave work at the end of the day. Social reproduction feminists would argue that when considering the working class more broadly and building working class power, we must consider what constitutes as work and acknowledge the potential to further disrupt capital in the streets, in the schools, in the home, wherever social reproduction takes place. Class struggle, in other words, signifies more than just the struggle over wages and working conditions. This framework also points to more possibilities for class solidarity. According to social reproduction theory, there is a false dichotomy between class struggles around economic issues and the so-called new social movements like anti-war movement, environmental movements, women's rights, LGBTQ movements, as well as prison abolition, Black Lives Matter, anti-poverty, and homelessness campaigns. Strategic organizing on this basis of restoring the sense of interconnectedness between class and other social relations, be they the most mundane aspects of everyday life, can reintroduce the idea that an injury to one is an injury to all. Nancy Fraser is a theorist well known for her critique of the so-called crisis of care. This idea that an imbalance of family and work caused by stagnant wages, increased cost of living, increased debt, and longer work hours to manage it all is making it difficult for people to raise children, take care of their loved ones, maintain households and communities. Care work is often women's work and often unpaid, but without it, she says, there could be no culture, no economy, no political organization. Further, ignoring the social reproduction dimension of this crisis, which would place it firmly within the Marxist tradition and in opposition to capitalism, misses the mark. What we have here is a crisis of capitalism, a crisis of the inability of the system to reproduce itself. This leads to increasing privatization of the social reproductive sphere, which results in this logic permeating all aspects of our lives. This also, of course, just further exacerbates the cycle of exploitation and oppression under capitalism. While some women are happy to spend the extra cash, most people can't. And those who can't are more likely to be paid for that work by those who can. These workers tend to be poor women of color. This is what women standing on the backs of other women to get ahead looks like. Bernie's flagship policies cut to the heart of this logic, and our panelists in a second will explain why and how in more detail. But the key takeaway here right now is that the framework of social reproduction is helpful in understanding the multidimensional complexity of the working class and the importance of their existence beyond the workplace in challenging capital. Struggles for decommodified healthcare, cleaner air, water, better schools, and affordable housing are also class struggles. So without further ado, I give you your panel.
My name is Ashley, she, her. I will be moderating this panel very lightly, but I just want to give introductions really quickly for each of our panelists. Here we have Vilma Serrano. She, her is a public school teacher and executive board member of her union, the Oakland Education Association. She's a passionate believer in the promise of public education and advocates for more sustainable teaching and learning conditions for both students and teachers through her work with OEA. Next, we have Allie Leahy, also uses she, her pronouns, has been an organizer for 8 years, working at several reproductive rights and justice organizations on campus to repeal the Hyde Amendment. Do you want to explain the Hyde Amendment really quickly before we go on?
Yeah, I'll go into it more into my presentation, but the Hyde Amendment is an annual congressional rider after Roe v. Wade was a Supreme Court case in 1973. Abortion was covered by public insurance, and what Henry Hyde did was say that's not going to happen, and so he passed this annual congressional rider. It's passed every year. It's signed every year by Congress that bans any sort of federal insurance from covering abortion. So that's mostly Medicaid. That's any sort of like federal insurance. If you're a member of the military, you're in the Peace Corps, it's very hard to get your abortion covered.
Thank you. You've also worked in fights against abortion bans and for expanded access in California, and in East Bay DSA, she serves on the steering committee and has organized for Bernie 2020 and social housing. And last but not least, we have Lucy Riley, she, her as well. She is is a union nurse activist, and she also organizes with the Richmond Progressive Alliance and was the social media director for our very dear Javanka Beckles during her 2018 primary election for state assembly. So Vilma, do you want to start?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Vilma, and I'm a public school teacher. So the case that I'm trying to make really is about labor. I really believe in that organized labor really is what it is going to take in order for the world to be transformed. We know that the courts are really not going to be, as was already mentioned, the courts are not going to be the way that we're going to win our battles, but organized labor will be a way that we will win the battles we need to win. And so in that sense, I really feel like that is one of the most feminist things I could even say. And to define what that means, I'm gonna look at my notes. Sorry about that. So I believe that Bernie Sanders' plan for workplace democracy can be seen as integral to the advancement of equality for all people, but especially workers from our most oppressed and vulnerable communities. I think what really stood out to me, particularly thinking of it through a feminist lens, was the domestic worker bill of rights that's part of the workplace democracy plan. So I guess I'll just define what feminism means to me using a really simple but really powerful definition by Bell Hooks, who's a really prominent Black scholar, Black feminist scholar, and she says, feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. Bernie Sanders' movement for the working class deeply embodies the hope that Bell Hooks has for a better world through feminism. And because of labor leaders who have come before me, which include militant women labor leaders, I have to say I have great health insurance, I have sick days, I have paid time off, and seniority. And as a working class person, my mom was a house cleaner. I'm Salvadoran American. I grew up very poor, and that's a lifeline that I definitely think about constantly, especially when I find myself sick or in some sort of vulnerable place where I'm like, you know what, this is not something that's afforded to everyone, and definitely not the community I come from. So I'm gonna bring up my mom because she has been sort of a guiding force for me in thinking about what it means to be a feminist outside of capitalist feminism, which I think for many of us I should speak for myself as a woman of color, it felt really defined by white feminism, which I wholeheartedly ran away from until I found bell hooks. And I think I found my way back to who I always was. So my mom was a domestic worker my whole life. In fact, it was through interacting with her bosses and through her labor that I really noticed the stark differences between the life that we had, very humble. Sometimes the bills couldn't get paid on time. Sometimes we didn't have light. Sometimes we didn't have heat. I mean, it's a smorgasbord of things. And thinking about how it was a struggle to keep the lights on in my tiny apartment. But then we would go to her boss's very large homes, and it was just shocking the type of differences they had and the endless amount of resources they had, in sending their children to elite private schools, extravagant vacations, and also the luxury of being able to pay their bills on time. That was all very striking to me. And so my mom was very fortunate to have mostly fair employers, but she walked a constant fine line between exploited worker or empowered worker, really dependent on the boss, on the day that the boss was having, or even really the year. Some years were fine, and some years were very devastating. She was very vulnerable. She would later tell me about how she would go to work like incredibly sick because she had no sick days and was afraid of getting fired. She was a single mom and she was the sole breadwinner for our household. And so, my mom's story is very similar to that of other domestic workers. So because domestic workers have been historically excluded from labor protections, Bernie's proposal to enact a domestic worker bill of rights to secure safe working conditions, collective bargaining, and also a living wage for all domestic workers is exciting and groundbreaking. This is often the labor that we don't think about when we think about labor. I think labor, when we think about it, we do think of like the more protected workers. We think of union members and these other sort of equally important but often faceless laborers are really, to have this be part of a national sort of platform for a candidate is just pretty incredible. And so, so I believe that these protections would really transform and improve the lives of these workers, largely Black and immigrant women, currently two of our most vulnerable and exploited workforces. So the recent rise in worker militancy and the ways in which the labor movement has created prominent women labor leaders in areas of childcare providers. So I don't know if you all heard, but recently they won a 15-year battle to collectively bargain with the state of California. So I'm an early childhood teacher, I should say. I've worked 10 years as a teacher, and 9 years has been with 5-year-olds. So I was a preschool teacher. Now I teach the same age, but through the elementary. So for me, this is like, it's exciting to see the kinds of things that are happening and how a Bernie Sanders presidency really could continue to push this agenda forward, making sure that all women, that all workers who are vulnerable have access to a lot of the rights that we all deserve. And so when we consider the impacts of workplace democracy, which also includes obviously a big part of around unionizing, it is clear that it's a win not just for women identifying folks, but for all of our most vulnerable workers, such as those from the queer and trans communities. It is through the possibility of protecting our queer and trans workers that we see truly the most feminist case for a Bernie Sanders presidency. As Bell Hooks has pointed out, true feminists believe that all people deserve dignity, respect, and safety. And so I have a quote from Teen Vogue. There is currently no federal law that protects queer and trans workers from being discriminated against at work. And the Trump administration reversed an Obama-era policy that classified bias against trans workers as a form of sex discrimination, which falls under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. With even that gone, queer and trans workers are left with no federal level of workplace protections and are subject to individual states' laws, which can also impact access to housing and healthcare. This means that a strong union contract is the only legally binding workplace protection available for queer, non-binary, and trans workers to fight employment discrimination. These communities have the highest rates of unemployment than other workers. Bernie Sanders' support for the workplace democracy for all truly is, again, I want to reiterate, one of the most feminist steps I think I've ever seen of any candidate ever. And so I will leave you with this quote from, not yet. The recent rise in worker uprisings, beginning with really the Chicago teachers, I think, brought back the strike back in 2012, I believe, and continuing on with the teacher strikes in West Virginia, LA, and now even we see now with the recent Wildcat strike at UC Santa Cruz, shout out to them, amongst others, have made material gains for workers and have inspired the working class revolution we have so desperately needed. But all workers, but in particular working class, trans, queer, and immigrant, Black, and brown women stand to benefit from the labor policies of a possible Sanders presidency. And so now I will leave you with a quote from Bell Hooks on Reimagining a Feminist World. Imagine living in a world where there is no domination, where females and males are not alike or even always equal, but where a vision of mutuality is the ethos shaping our interaction. Imagine living in a world where we can all be who we are, a world of peace and possibility. Feminist revolution alone will not create such a world. We need to end racism, class elitism, imperialism. Bernie Sanders, with his movement for the working class, I believe is a candidate that brings us closer to fight all of the oppressions that harm us all.
Hi all, my name's Allie Leahy. Like Ashley said, I've been a reproductive rights and justice organizer for 8 years. I am part of DSA for the last 2. I've also worked at a domestic violence shelter for a year. And so when I think about housing, I oftentimes think about the experiences that I had working at a shelter and what it's like for people to be seeking shelter. So the question I've had too, when I was pitching this event to Jackie, I was like, what is feminism? Because I feel like that's sort of the crux of the question here. Whole classes could be taught on that, right? And to me, I kept coming to this thought of power and what power is and how it's distributed in society. And I feel like the sort of feminism for the 1% or capitalist feminism or white feminism, it's about giving power to a small group of people who look more like us. So a small group of women CEOs or a woman landlord who will evict people or women ICE officers, when it's really about distributing power back to working class women and a majority of people. I also thought a lot about how not modern feminism, but sort of mainstream feminism is often about sort of representation and having someone that looks like you, and the assumption that if someone looks like you and they're in power, that they're gonna represent your interests, when I actually think that's proven over and over again not to be accurate. And I also thought about what is power, and to me it's about having agency and autonomy and the ability to influence what happens in our own lives, and I believe that's what socialism is ultimately about. So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into 2 big sort of pillars around that, especially around autonomy and reproductive justice and housing. There's this weird assumption out there in the reproductive rights world, which is pretty unfriendly to Bernie Sanders, that Bernie is like not good on reproductive rights, or that he is like bad on, he doesn't know about like reproductive justice principles, or that he's even anti-choice. I think it's like a weird association, and it's happened a few times with other like socialist and class struggle candidates I've seen running. And so I really want to dispel that. I think it's really important to maintain that like Bernie is the reproductive justice candidate. And that what I mean by reproductive justice is not just access to abortion and not just access to birth control, but the ability to have children that are thriving and the ability to make the best decisions for ourselves and our families. And, you know, if you choose to have children, that they're not going to be stop and frisked by Mike Bloomberg's, you know, mayor time, you know? So the RJ has a very similar sort of history as the word intersectionality. It was started by Black women organizers and scholars in the 80s and 90s to sort of shape a framework that wasn't being represented by the mainstream movement. And I feel like Bernie definitely sort of represents that in a lot of ways, particularly with Medicare for All, because in the end, like any sort of means testing or like limitations on healthcare is not going to meet the needs of every person. And that one thing I really love about Medicare for All is that it would overturn the Hyde Amendment. And that's a very explicit part of like Bernie's agenda, that he is not going to compromise on this. This is likely going to be the issue that could derail Medicare for All. And he is holding strong on that. And he has always held strong on these issues. And I think too, when I think about power and reproductive justice, this is about like putting the power back into our own hands to make decisions for ourselves. And I think it's also like being less dependent on our social relationships. I think about like childcare too. And Bernie yesterday at the rally like talked about universal childcare for everyone. And I think that that is like such a strong reproductive justice principle, because how the hell do you have children and decide to have children when you have to pay thousands of dollars a year in order to have your children cared for? I don't think that really makes it a choice by any means. And so, yeah, I mean, Bernie's platform also, he wants to codify he wants to codify Roe v. Wade, which I think is really important. And he's also said that he will not appoint any sort of judges who are against Roe v. Wade, which I think is a really powerful stance. A lot of the other candidates haven't said. I mean, when you have Joe Biden up there saying that he would be down to run with a Republican, and he was very wishy-washy on the Hyde Amendment, I don't think that gives a lot of faith in his candidacy compared to someone like Bernie, who's been amazing on this issue for so long. The other thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about was housing. And so how is Bernie's housing like a feminist issue? And I think ultimately Bernie's difference in his housing platform is not about it's not about incentivizing a supply, which is giving power to the landlords in the real estate industry to let them build a bunch of housing. And I think ultimately it comes to this definition of feminism of redistributing the power. So it's basically Bernie's platform around housing is redistributing power to tenants over landlords, which is what I think will ultimately solve the housing crisis. And I also want to uplift that ACE, the largest tenant union in California, just endorsed Bernie. Very exciting. That's the first time they've ever endorsed any presidential candidate, which I think says a lot about Bernie and his platform and what it'll do for tenants. I've also think that Bernie, he like explicitly, when it comes to like not being like pro development and like pro real estate, he literally says he wants to combat gentrification, exclusionary zoning, segregation, and speculation, which is really powerful. And because especially since that targets like communities of color and Black and brown parents in red line neighborhoods, and particularly single mothers who oftentimes are the ones who are the most likely to suffer from homelessness, which he talked about yesterday, which I thought was really incredible that he brought that into the room. I oftentimes think about when it comes to houselessness and eviction. When I worked at the domestic violence shelter for a year, I talked to this woman who I worked with, and she told me that one time when she talked about her housing situation, she said everyone gets evicted at least once in their life. And I think about that a lot, in the fact that so many people, like landlords, target people in real estate associations and real estate corporations target people so much that is like the expectation of so many people, that eviction, like something that is like so violent, is just a normal thing that happens to people, when in reality it should never happen. And evictions we should be a moratorium on any sort of evictions. And then the other thing about Bernie and his feminist housing policy is how landlords use domestic violence to evict tenants. I've heard of so many stories of women who are experiencing violence, and their landlords use it as an excuse to evict them and then drive the price up of the unit. So women, it'll be loud or it'll be dangerous, and they're told, like, you have to leave because we're getting too many complaints. And I feel like there's nothing more feminist than having more aggressive tenant protections, because it protects women who are experiencing violence or who are fired for being queer or trans. And sort of the last part about housing that I think about that's really feminist is the idea of like public housing and how it combats like this hyper individualism. Because if we have more housing that's like more dense and we're all closer to each other and we're less separated from each other, we're able to learn and be together more frequently. And so I think that's Bernie lays out a really beautiful platform for that, to like have tons more public, beautiful social housing. And I think that could be one of the many reasons why we come together in a more collective way. And just to wrap it up, the reason why I think like Bernie is the ultimate feminist candidate is because in my feminist journey, I got really tired of like begging for equality and like begging people to just like treat each other better, because we can do that and like we can hold each other to that expectation and keep trying that, and we should. But I don't think it's ultimately going to be the most like effective way of doing things than like having a political revolution where we see the things that are the same with each other and show up in solidarity with each other and understand each other's struggles. And I feel like being together and united will make things better. And that is not, ultimately, this is aspiring to power is not the ultimate feminist mission, but it's about being collective and accountable to each other. So I wanted to just like wrap up my section. Oh, that's my alarm. Yep. With a quote. From Jenny Brown, who wrote The Abortion Struggle Now, who I was on a panel with Megan a couple months ago. That was really beautiful. And she has a really amazing like case around reproductive justice and democratic socialism. And the quote is, "The role of the organizer is to dissipate fear through organization, support, sisterhood, telling the truth, and making public what was once private, and more until so many people have talked about their abortions." And I also feel like the same thing can be said about democratic socialism and our everyday struggles together. And that ultimately that's our mission as socialist feminists.
All right, we feeling good? We ready to win an election? All right. Everybody got blue marks on their door, on the knuckles from knocking on doors? Yeah? Okay, let's see if we can inspire some folks to go knock on some doors for these last 2 weekends. So my name is Lucy Riley. I've earned each and every one of these gray hairs. 26 years at the bedside as an ICU nurse. I started off working in Memphis, Tennessee, where we were the number 3 homicide capital per capita in the United States. And then I worked in New Orleans after that, where we were the number 1 homicide per capita in the United States. And then I moved to, after 10 years, I moved to Oakland, California, where I became a proud member of the California Nurses Association. And probably 3 or 4 years into working at Summit Hospital here in Oakland, we started a series of 9 strikes It took us about 2.5 years to beat back 102 takeaways from our contract. And if you've ever worked on contract negotiations, you know that there's usually 2 to 3 takeaways that the bosses want, and then there's 2 or 3 things that the union wants, right? So this was at a time where Scott Walker, right, was governor of Wisconsin, Scott the Snake Walker. And he was trying to gut the head of labor, right? And so it was after the recession, and we were going on strike during the recession, right? It's not a time that anybody wants to hear, really, about nurses wanting better wages and benefits, right? 2.5 years later, we gave up a couple of princess perks. We kept our contract intact, and we put down Pat Fry, who was voted the #1 businessman of the year in Sacramento, right, when he was trying to gut our contract for making more money per employee than anybody else in the healthcare industry, both private and public, all right? Think about that for a minute, right? So I like to say that I was educated on second wave feminism, Bella and Gloria. I was raised on intersectional feminism, on 9 strike lines, on 2.5 years working side by side with my sister nurses who were gonna be damned if we were gonna let a corporate beast like Sutter take us down and destroy what we had worked for 20 years for with the California Nurses Association to build the best contract in the Bay Area. And I'm proud of those years, and I'm proud of that understanding that I came to. So when we're talking about Bernie Sanders and what he's running for in 2020, let's be honest. He's got a great platform, but he's running on Medicare for all. And why do I say that? Because that's what he gets attacked for, right? Left, right, and center, he gets attacked for Medicare for all. How are we gonna pay for it? So I wanna talk for a little bit. I've got a Southern accent. You guys detect that I'm not from around here, right? So I talk a little long and I talk a little slow, so if I get past 10 minutes, you guys thump me on the head over here, okay? Let me know. So what I want to talk a little bit about now is what Medicare for All is not. Medicare for All is not the present system of healthcare delivery in America, which is curative medicine, which quite simply is defined as profiting off the backs of sick people. I want that to sink in. Okay? What we do not do in this country is practice preventative medicine, like most countries in the civilized world do, where they save the billions and billions of dollars that we are wasting on curative medicine by preventing simple things like high blood pressure and diabetes from ever getting out of control enough that they cause a stroke or a heart attack. In inner city Oakland, where I work, the largest number of patients that come in with heart attacks and strokes are folks that are either uninsured or underinsured. And what do I mean when I say that when it pertains to going to see your doctor, okay? That means that people cannot afford to go and see their doctor when they've got a headache and they just take Tylenol for it. What they don't know is that their blood pressure is 180/100 and they're about to burst a blood vessel in their head and have a stroke and be debilitated for the rest of their lives, right? Underinsured, people who are working 40 hours a week. They may be paying $200 to $300 every paycheck for their health insurance, but they've got a $7,000 or $8,000 deductible, and that prevents them from going in to see their doctor to get that same diagnosis where they could get a $10 prescription per month for a drug like lisinopril and keep that blood pressure in check and never wind up under my care and my ICU on the brink of death. So Medicare for All is a feminist issue because it is a collective attempt to care for all of us. And that is the meaning of not me, us. So when we're talking about how we are going to transform this system of curative medicine, where we are literally wasting billions of dollars a year waiting for people to get so sick that they have to come in for a couple $100,000 medical bill, which is what's going to happen if you're in the hospital for 3 to 4 weeks at a time, and you're in ICU for that time. That's how much it costs. And Vestopedia has the top 10 medical procedures that are performed in the US, of the most costliest procedures. To get a heart transplant, it's over $1 million. A double lung transplant, it's $1.3 million. The most expensive care modality that we deliver in the United States of America is dialysis. Did you know that? It's a $24.7 billion a year industry. It's at a moderate growth rate of 3.8% a year. The average cost, take a deep breath, the average cost, annual cost for delivering dialysis care is $90,000. I want you to think about that. There are over 500,000 people getting dialysis in this country annually. Do you know the main causes of kidney failure? High blood pressure and diabetes. Again, we're coming back to two disease processes that could be intervened early on in the disease process for somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 a month. There's a pill that a diabetic patient can take that can normalize their blood sugar. That's less than $10 a month. A far cry from the hundreds of $600, $700 a month for an insulin vial, right? But it's all, again, about preventative health care, all right? So getting back to dialysis care, just one treatment modality alone, $90,000 annually, all right? So 90 divided by 12 is what? $700 and something, $7,000 a month? Let's talk about what that $7,000 a month could do in the community, because Medicare for All, there's an extension of this definition. All of the savings that we could redistribute with $8,000 a month, $7,000 a month, think about that. $1,000 housing voucher for 7 different women, right? That are facing the same issues that you talked about, What could we do with this money? Medicare for All is a direct route to community health. It sounds like a simple concept, but it's really deep. When we're talking about public health, it's not just about treating someone's disease process. It's about looking at what caused that disease process to begin with. If you are in a permanent state of trauma in your daily lives because you are suffering from poverty, police brutality, domestic violence, any number of social ills, your possibility, and I'm going to go further than possibility, you are a sitting duck for the disease processes that are going to bring you into the hospital and cause an early death. We are seeing the life expectancy of Americans drop for the first time in 100 years. Folks, there is no other option for us than Medicare for All. It is an idea whose time has come. It is an idea that women have been talking about for a long time, because we, as mothers, as teachers, as nurses, as domestic violence project workers, we see the most egregious fallout from corporate greed. People who are neglected by the system, who are forgotten by the system, who have given up, who were never given bootstraps to begin with, which is a violent concept, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps when you were never given any to begin with. We are at a moral crossroads in this country. And that is the conversation that I have with my nurses who want to vote for Elizabeth Warren because she's a woman. And I think I have one or two that smoke some really good weed and want to vote for Amy Klobuchar. I'm not sure where they got that idea from, that she'd be a good president. But, you know, it is a difficult conversation to have with my fellow nurses that want to vote for Elizabeth Warren. And I tell them, the complaints that you have at the bedside, and some of the most frightening experiences that we have as nurses at the bedside, are what is not talked about on the evening news. It's not a conversation that nurses are really even allowed to have about specific patients because there are federal privacy laws that prevent me from talking to you about the most egregious cases in detail. But what I can tell you is that in the United States of America, we treat our pets at the end of their lives with more decency and humanity than we do our elderly fellow citizens. Because I make a dark joke every time we have to torture an 80-year-old who's come to us from the nursing home, that's been laying in a bed for 20 years with a stroke, whose family has forgotten them, who has a conservator over them, and we are poking them and prodding them, and they have not communicated with anyone in 20 years. And let me assure you, this happens all over this country because there are billions of dollars to be made from torturing sick people. Do no harm is a sick joke when it comes to many of our elderly patients, that we cannot make across the board in this country humane decisions in every state. Some states are more progressive than others. California is getting there, but many states do not allow what many people would call mercy killing. We make a sick joke that everybody's a millionaire in the last 30 days because every intervention that can be made that is going to make a profit is made off of the most vulnerable patients in our communities who cannot speak for themselves anymore. Medicare for all would require a conversation with your doctor when you're 40 years old to talk about what your end-of-life wishes are. And let me promise you, in 26 years at the bedside, I have never talked to an awake and alert and oriented patient who's told me that they want to lie in a bed with a breathing tube for the last 30 days of their life when they know there's nothing that can be done for them. There is so much waste in the system as it is. And when you talk to people who want to vote, especially women who want to vote for Elizabeth Warren, I want you to push them on what Elizabeth Warren has to say about when she would institute Medicare for all, that she just got excited about, right, in the last year or so, right? She hadn't been too excited about Medicare for all. How many years in the Senate, right? And none of those years she was a Republican, right? None of those years she was excited about Medicare for all. So I want you to talk to them about what Elizabeth Warren has got to say about Medicare for all, because instituting Medicare for all her third year in office, she might as well say it's dead in the water, because nothing is going to happen. She's kicking that can down the road. And when people ask you, how are we going to pay for it, which is the mainstream media mantra, I want you to tell them, you think that your private insurance is going to take care of you when you're sick. That is why you're believing this idea that we can't pay for Medicare for all. Do you know that if you're sick enough to have to leave your job after 3 months, your private insurance goes goodbye? And you start paying COBRA benefits at the tune of about $1,800 a month? Who can afford to pay that when you've got cancer and you're going in for chemo treatments? Who can afford to do that, right? So these conversations that we have with our friends, with our coworkers about Medicare for all are the key to changing their minds to voting for Bernie Sanders. We can't afford Medicare for all. We can't afford to continue curative medicine in this country. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to our children. Folks, we can do this. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Can you give them another round of applause? All right, thank you. So now this section for the next 30 minutes is going to be a Q&A from the whole group. And I will take stacks, so please raise your hand if you have questions. And I even have a few questions if nobody wants to ask any. I see one person in the front, Megan.
Hello, everyone. Panelists, okay. This is more a comment that I'd like to hear your responses to. So I've had this is prompted by something that Lucy said toward the end. I've had two grandparents pass away in the last couple of years, so I have, for the first time in my life, become intimate with some of the things that you were talking about, what happens at the end of a person's life and who's expected to care for them. I did read a New York Times article from like a year and a half ago that said, I think the headline was something to the extent of, the best long-term care insurance is a conscientious adult daughter. So obviously there's a sort of cultural problem, which is that, men and women, different things are expected of them, right? I feel like the feminist project, or as it's currently conceived, if it doesn't have a sort of like grounding in class analysis or in a socialist vision, tends to think that the feminist project is to change our conceptions about what's expected of men and women. And certainly that's something that we want to do, right? But it's a very long-term project. In the meantime, Medicare for All would simply relieve millions, I mean, literally hundreds of millions of adult women from the responsibility of being conscientious to their parents, right? And taking care of their parents. So I just wanted to, I guess, raise the sort of place where the cultural stuff intersects with the systematic stuff, and ask you guys what you thought about this idea that maybe there's some confusion about what the feminist project actually is. Is it to change attitudes, or is that something that we do in a long-term sense and along the way, but in the short term, it's critical to actually change the system itself?
Which of the three of you would like to take this question?
So, cost analysis, you guys get it, it's kind of my thing. So the average nursing home patient, depending on what state you're living in, $6,000 a month. In the Bay Area, it's closer to $9,000 a month. And that is with the roommate. You'd think you had a penthouse apartment for that, right? And that is whether you can walk to the bathroom on your own, feed yourself or not, right? That's a lot of damn money. It's a lot of cash. There have been quite a few, bills passed around about that haven't made it to the federal level to be enacted yet. About how about we pay those conscientious adult daughters to take care of their family members at home, right? As opposed to the Kaiser model now, which is, hey, you're part of community health. Why don't you take mom or dad home and take care of them? While you've got a full-time job raising kids and you're part of the sandwich generation, right? It's an untenable ask. It just cannot be done. So yeah, there's so much that can be done with the Medicare for All mindset, where we are looking at paying women who have been traditionally doing care work at home and not getting paid for that. Yes, absolutely. That answer your question?
I want to add to that. I think that's our the oldest daughter analogy is interesting. It reminds me of in reproductive health care right now. It's really like you luck out if you have a sister or a friend who helps you navigate a really complicated system of getting access to the care that you need. And it's like accessing abortion, accessing reproductive health care. Especially if you're a young woman or a teenager in a lot of states, you have to think about like, how do you get to the clinic? You have to pay for a hotel if there's a 24-hour waiting period and you have to drive 3 hours. A lot of the clinics you can't take your kids in, so you have to find childcare. There's really complicated laws. There's even fake clinics that pretend to be abortion providers. And you walk in and you realize it's a crisis pregnancy center rather than an abortion clinic. So it reminds me a lot of that too, right? Like navigating a lot of care and like being taken care of, you have to like have someone help you navigate that. And so what I'd love to see for Medicare for All is like, not only do you like not have to have like sort of luck out with all of that assistance or all of those resources, but you're just it's a much more simple process. And it's like, you have the dignity of not having to like go through these horrible, traumatizing processes.
So it's interesting that you say that, because that's like the exact tension that I wrestle with constantly, because that is the unsaid expectation for all Salvadorians and probably all like a lot of like first generation people like myself. I mean, and so I think when I hear thinking about like the feminist project, right? Like, or the term that you use, I think for me it's not necessarily it's like unpeeling even the metacognition around this is what this is and this is part of patriarchy, because I think even understanding that is like an undue burden that is put on me whether I like it or not, and the implications of rejecting that is really significant as well. It means walking away from your family, possibly. It means isolating yourself potentially. So it is like significant. And I guess I don't necessarily have more to add, but I just wanted to bring that perspective of tension that I'm constantly feeling. Yeah. And so I guess I also wanted to say around, I think when I think about like how feminism intersects with, or doesn't intersect sometimes with, class analysis, I think even having going back to Bell Hooks' definition around mutuality is really important for me when I think about my framing. It's not that, well, okay, I'm still forming my thoughts, so I might have to come back to that, but anyway, whatever.
Any more hands? We can maybe take a couple questions at once. Julia, right? Oh my gosh, we just met. Hello.
So my friend wanted to come tonight, but she couldn't come because she has a child. And as far as I know, there was no childcare here. So I'm wondering if we can make that happen. I mean, I know I try to make a donation. Maybe people could pay an extra $1 towards childcare, but it seems like, especially for a discussion like this, it would be great if mothers could come. And then maybe we could expand that, and maybe if there was canvassing, we could provide childcare somehow. Like every time I canvass, I'm happy to pay a couple extra bucks for the childcare.
Thank you.
So I wish Laura were here. Is that Laura Ann? Mara. Sorry, Laura. Okay, I'm old. So we are actually addressing that issue. We have a group of volunteers that have been doing some childcare training so that we make sure that we're all on the same page, right, on how we want to treat our youngest members of DSA with respect and make sure that the parents feel safe with their precious children in our hands, right? So that's all important too. So at the general meeting, once a month, we are having childcare, all right? So if you'd like to bring your friend to that meeting, and I think that Mara would really appreciate some parents' input, especially some mothers of young children, so that we can better assess the needs of our future members, our future adult members as well. I think that this is especially for moms. Do we have any moms in the audience? Okay, so I'm a mom. Yeah, I know these meetings they're pretty tough for me. I dragged my kids out to 9 strike lines. One was in Pampers. I encouraged all of my nurses, don't you miss that strike. You be there. You bring your entire family. You bring your parents too. You bring everybody. If we pay good money to CNA for our dues, and CNA is going to feed everybody that shows up for the strike line for lunch, right? So I think it's this mentality of, and I'm going to be a little forward here, of mothers, especially single mothers, not asking if there's going to be childcare. I want to see single mothers demand that DSA have childcare. And I think that we've got the resources and the woman power within our organization to make that happen. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Absolutely. Okay.
I just want to add too that most of our events do say if you need childcare to request it to the organizers on there, and if it's not on there, we'll make sure to do a better job, because I know that some of the meetings that I organize, we do make sure that's on there. Any more questions? We have 15 minutes, is plenty of time. Yes, Joe.
As an old guy who was, shall we say, heavily impacted by the rise of the women's movement, sometimes against my will, I think looking back, I can say, then this is something that I feel is I have a brotherly relationship with Bernie around this, that, that the women's movement gave some of us of our generation an opportunity that our fathers and our grandfathers, mostly, some exceptions, but mostly didn't have. An opportunity to visualize a way to be a man in the society that was different. That was different than what had historically been presented by the patriarchal and then, starting in the 19th century, the capitalist version of patriarchy, of the breadwinner. And, it didn't matter if you never saw your kids. It didn't matter if you never saw your wife, except when you made the next baby. What was important was you brought home enough money, and that was all that was important. And after that, it was okay if you had a little thing on the side or you drank a little too much or whatever. But that was sort of the definition. And the women's movement gave us, men of our generation, a great gift by beginning to outline how it could be different. And so I feel personally feel great gratitude to that. And I feel like one of the reasons that Bernie is a feminist candidate is because he went through that process. If you read the books that he's written, he talks about that some. And because he wasn't born with certain kinds of ideas any more than anybody else was, the product of experience. And I think that, that needs to be said, because it's not just as the issue of childcare is not just a woman's issue of Medicare for all is, and the issue of of social reproduction is not just a woman's issue. The whole issue of what life should be like is not just a woman's issue. It's not just a matter of what's at the job and not on the job. I'm starting to babble, so I'll stop. But I'd like to hear reactions to any or all of that sort of. Thank you for your listening to this somewhat disjointed monologue.
Which of the three would you like to take this?
I have a question. I'm really interested in hearing more about what you're saying, that it was a gift. And I'm curious about what those specific gifts were. Like, was it around understanding the different positionalities of men and women and hearing it from women? Was it thinking about yourself in that place? I would love to hear more if you're open to sharing more around some of those learnings.
Well, a couple of things. One, the idea that physical force was the ultimate of anything. That was sort of the ultimate definition of being masculine, of being male. And the worst thing, and in all male groups, and it's still true to a great extent. I mean, you don't see it because you're not in all male groups by definition. But in many, many, many all male groups, still, the worst thing you can call somebody is a woman, or more likely a pussy, or a faggot. I mean, that's still the ultimate insult in all male groups to a great extent. And rather than just eating that, and especially among the large number of men who are not particularly physically powerful or physically brave or athletic or any of those things, those are injuries that persist in your life with no place to go with them. That's one example.
One thing I think about in terms of like masculinity and like how it'll be transformed under the socialist feminist utopia we're going to build together is like how people like root their masculinity in and like what that looks like. One thing I think about a lot is this statistic I heard, which is like abusive men are most likely to murder their partners right after they're fired from their jobs. And like what that means in terms of like labor and like accumulation of capital and like masculinity, and the fact that like oftentimes being fired from your job is like a threat to your power, and like that for that to be like that reaction to it or that sort of like result of that. I think about like sort of that idea a lot, and how masculinity is going to have to just like look a lot different when it's not about like being rich, and it's not about like this like seeking like power, which ultimately means like access to like women's bodies in the sort of like traditional way. So that's one thing I think about a lot, and like that we're going to have to sort of grapple with as we transform society and as we sort of define what is masculinity to a lot of people.
Any more questions? Ooh, all right. Yeah, in the hat. Do you want to?
I always feel a little uncomfortable talking in the microphone or something. The reverb, it makes me feel weird. Anyway, comrades, this has been an excellent discussion so far, and I really like all the points everyone's brought up about the question of women's oppression and its relationship to, exploitation of the working class. Clearly, these two things are completely aligned, and they always have been, in the course of the history of capitalism, but through class society in general. So my question really is going to be a little bit point by point, and I think about, first off, what does Bernie Sanders mean as an individual? I think he always talks about we and not us, and he rightly sees that it's about the masses, and there's this mass movement that's really sort of fall behind him of millions of people that have stirred. And I think that really is what the rich billionaires and the capitalists are mostly afraid of. Not so much Bernie. Bernie's been around for a long time, but it's the masses that they're really afraid of. And, I think that there was some contention with people who supported Bernie in 2016 between those who were kind of in the Bernie or bust crowd and those who were not. And that they thought that the DNC had basically cheated Bernie out of, in the primaries, essentially. So my question is, if that happens again, if Bernie is cheated by the DNC, by the Democratic Party, what will be the position of people who are fighting against women's oppression, of the DSA specifically, in terms of how we orient towards Bernie? If Bernie ran as an independent, for instance, if he was cheated, would we support that? Or would we have to move towards, supporting other Democratic candidates like Pete Buttigieg with his Medicare for all who want it, which is clearly just an asinine and terrible program that will help no one. Or Elizabeth Warren, which I think there was some criticism about, but who has said that she's essentially a capitalist and supports capitalism. So yeah, that's my essential question.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering, I just wanted to ask maybe a follow-up, because it seems a little bit off topic from what we're talking about tonight. It does seem like a little bit of a larger conversation. And what do you mean, like, is there a socialist feminist position as to what we would do if, is that what you're asking, if Bernie's cheated versus what maybe a non-socialist, non-feminist socialist position? Is that what you're asking?
So I'm sure we all have beautiful individual opinions, but the DSA last year at the National Convention adopted an official position that said that we are not going to actively endorse or campaign for any other presidential candidate besides Bernie. It was oftentimes referred to as the Bernie or bust resolution, and it was portrayed in the media weirdly and like online as like, oh, they're betraying people. And part of what I see in the narrative though is like it's sometimes portrayed as like, oh, you're betraying women by not voting for whoever the Democratic nominee is, because you're potentially risking like Trump going into office, which I like totally disagree with, like especially with Bloomberg right now being such a thing, which really bothers me. I have zero faith in Bloomberg and the Socialist Feminist project, but DSA does have an official position on it. And I'm assuming, with any sort of organization, we have to sort of see what happens on the ground. Like if things really blow up at the DNC this summer, like it could be a really big opportunity for strikes, for protests, for growing our organization. So it'll probably shift depending on what happens. But I just think I don't think it's anti-feminist to not vote for whoever the Democratic nominee is if it's not Bernie.
I think we have time. We have 5 minutes, so maybe one more question. Do you mind if I use progressive stack, Eric, and pick someone who appears to be a woman? All right. Over here.
So sort of at the moment, the favorite attack on Bernie by like establishment liberals and mainstream media is this like calling his supporters Bernie bros and like painting them as this kind of like white angry males. And as we clearly can see here, that's not the case. So how do you feel about this, and how do you sort of answer to these kinds of accusations?
Thank you.
So the mainstream media got it wrong by one vowel. Instead of an O, it should have been an A, because we are all Bernie bras up here. And what we found out since this narrative has really come out is that Bernie actually has more women supporters than any other candidate, and more young women too. Because working class women realize that what has happened in the last 4 years is not just an election. Election is a moment. Working class women have realized that this is a movement that we're building here. And like the movement of so many historical movements in America, the United States, have come from the ground up. It's not a government down, change, systemic change that happens. And this grassroots energy around Bernie Sanders, the movement to elect Bernie Sanders, is something that most people in this country have never seen in their lifetimes. And it's electric, it's energetic, and hopefully it's going to propel us to build a labor party in this country, which is why I'm sitting at this desk right here. And this is the best chance we've had to do that in my lifetime, if not this century.
I mean, I challenge anyone to say Bernie's base is a bunch of white men to go knock doors in a diverse neighborhood and see what the response is like. Because here in Oakland and Berkeley, San Leandro, 70 to 80% of the doors that open up to DSA say, wow, I love Bernie. I am a big fan of him. And oftentimes it's just making sure people know that their vote matters. And so I feel like it's just so silly whenever I see it online. I see it all the time, every day. But every time I go out and canvass for Bernie, it totally proves me wrong every single time. At that rally yesterday, on the stage, everywhere you could see, not the stereotype that you see. So it just feels so easy to like change that narrative, because it's just so, you could see it very easily.
Thank you. We have 2 more minutes. So Erica, do you still want to ask your question? I saw your hand.
Thanks, Ashley. So my question is about kind of, whether, even if Bernie wins or if Bernie loses, I think we're still going to have to, work to keep the pressure on to make sure the things we want to have happen, and they happen on a local level. And especially if he loses, how do we make sure that we do get universal health care? How do we repeal the Hyde Amendment and things like that? And so I'm just wondering what kinds of strategies and tactics you guys think are possible and are needed right now, because I think we can't go back to what we were doing before, which is relying on politicians and nonprofits. Even something like Planned Parenthood that we all can agree is a universal good. They provide services to people who really need them, are a liberal establishment that don't support Medicare for all. And so what are the strategies that we can use, whether that's protests in front of crisis pregnancy centers that Allie talked about, these like fake abortion clinics, or, just, I guess I'm thinking like in terms of strategy and tactics, what are the things that we can use to really escalate the situation? Because even in blue states where abortion is technically legal, our rights are being rolled back, healthcare prices across the board are rising, and so, we can't go back to the way it was. So that's my question.
I mean, that's such a great question. I feel like there's so many like strategies and tactics we can use to continue to build towards democratic socialism. I mean, there's so many like just big things. I think the thing about Bernie, the thing that I try not to say is like this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. In some ways, it really is. Bernie is just so incredible, and the energy around it right now, this minute, is incredible. But I also think Bernie is inspiring thousands of other people to run for office, to organize their workplaces. And I think like using the energy and the inspiration behind Bernie in order to, have more militant labor unions, to have new workplaces be organizing, like Tartine Union with the Bread and Roses logo. Like that is so exciting. And I don't know if anything like that could have happened without Bernie running for office. I think of Heidi Sloan, who's running for Congress in Texas right now. I don't know if Heidi would have maybe been down that path if it wasn't for someone like Bernie inspiring democratic socialism and growing DSA. So I think like continuing to think like this is just the beginning in a lot of ways. I think around like reproductive rights specifically and crisis pregnancy centers, the anti-choice movement is like small. Like it is just they just have a lot of power consolidated and a lot of money. So part of it to me is like tracing where that money is and learning, like figuring out how to disrupt it. Like these places have fundraisers and like they sit in a room and like talk about how to expand these. Like how do we infiltrate that? How do we like make sure people aren't giving them a ton of money? And lastly, around like reproductive rights, like direct action. Jenny Brown in her book outlines the fight for expanding emergency contraception or the morning after pill. And originally, the original proposal to expand it to making it not by a pharmacy, but over the counter was really weak and restricted and age restricted. And she like went and like basically chained herself to the FDA with a bunch of other comrades and said, we're not going to stop until you make this over the counter for people of all ages. And I think we have to have those same demands and those same attitudes for medication abortion, for all sorts of like reproductive health care. So I think those are the big things.
So really quick, we've got like 30 seconds, okay? All right, let me speed it up. When Bernie did not walk away magically with the nomination from the convention, and I was a Bernie delegate in 2016, and let me tell you, there were hundreds and hundreds of my fellow Bernie delegates from all over the country that thought somehow magically Bernie was going to walk away with the nomination from a rigged primary and a rigged convention. There was no way that was going to happen. I knew that going in because I've been out here on the left for a long time. I knew that there was no way that was going to happen. There was a rule that superdelegates were not supposed to vote in the first round. Guess what happened on the convention floor? All right, and there was no stopping that. There was no turning that around. A lot of people were heartbroken. A lot of people threw in the towel. A lot of people got behind Jill Stein. We saw a fracturing of our movement. Roseanne DeMauro, who was a national director of National Nurses United at the time, which you know is the umbrella organization over about 180,000 nurses nationwide, right? We've got about 80,000 nurses organized here in the state of California with the California Nurses Association. So Roseanne shifted right back into Medicare for All gear with getting Michael Leidy to write SB 562, which was a single-payer bill here in the state of California. We organized hundreds of our Bernie delegates from here in the state of California to run for assembly delegates to basically try to take over the Democratic Party in the state of California. We weren't successful in doing that, but we came damn close, and we're going to keep working that angle. Inside-out strategy. Many state parties across this country, Bernie delegates did run for positions in their state party, and they did take over their state parties. So that is still happening, right? The key to keeping these issues that are so important to us alive is a multi-pronged strategy, right? But legislation is key. And I think that organizations like our labor unions, hopefully DSA, are going to take the reins on writing bills ourselves and going and pushing and demanding our state legislators take this to the assembly floor, take these bills to the Senate floor, right? Because organizing around not just complaining, which is great, and we have to do that, okay? But demanding specifically what we want in legislation is a key to getting not just those of us who are activists and who are out on the front lines of marches and rallies, but getting all of our folks at home that will donate, right? Just like they've donated more than any other presidential candidate in U.S. history. We can get those folks to donate to DSA to get us on a bus to go to Sacramento. What would that look like? We can get them to join DSA whether they ever show up for a meeting. We'll take your $27, right? Okay? There are so many things that we can do. Legislation has got to be part of it.
We are out of time, but can we thank our lovely panelists? Vilma had to leave early, so let's thank her too.